So welcome everyone to this webinar, which is hosted by the FinBio program. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the FinBio program, it's a MISTRA-funded research program focused on conducting biodiversity-related science that can be decision useful for the financial and corporate community. The full name is actually Finance to Revive Biodiversity. SRC, or the Stockholm Resilience Centre, is a lead partner, but we also have other members in our consortium. That is IVL here in Stockholm, Gothenburg University, Natural History Museum, and also a UK partner represented by the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investments, which are based at Oxford. The Sustainable Finance Lab is also one of FinBio's networking partners, and we're really happy to be able to draw on our joint mutual networks when running seminars and events like this one. So the Sustainable Finance Lab also has one of its aims to deliver scientific insights that strengthen financial sector practice. So in that, we're kind of united, and we thank SFL and others to promote this webinar. So just some practical details before we dive into content. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity, and in fact, we encourage you and hope that you will ask questions. And you can do that by either raising your hand, which you do digitally, by clicking on the heart symbol that is at the bottom of your screen. If you just wave your mouse over it a little bit, you click on that heart screen and you'll come up and you can click to raise your hands. Also, if there are any questions during the presentation, you can also use the question and answers chat field to pose questions that we can then come back to during the question and answer sessions. And you do that by clicking on the circle with little dots called More, at least for me. That's the icon at the bottom right. And you click on that and you go to the Q&A field and you can type in your question. Right. So now on to content. Today's webinar will focus on Inform, an investor framework to support asset owners and managers in biodiversity risk mitigation. And the background to why we developed this are two parallel trends that we've witnessed. One is the rapid degradation of nature and biodiversity loss that we're all seeing, and the very tangible risks to society and assets that are, in fact, already materializing as a result. But we're also seeing a gap in knowledge among those tasked with engaging with companies in investment portfolios. And this is a concern because engagement is actually critical. Asset owners and asset managers that are working on behalf of owners are not just passive observers of corporate progress. You can, and we believe you should also be active drivers of corporate change. But guiding companies on the journey towards improved biodiversity outcomes can seem quite daunting, I imagine, especially if you don't have a scientific background. So Inform was designed to help you do that, regardless of your background. It's intended to be a help to those of you who are working in this space, not to bog you down with yet another framework. And it's been developed to complement initiatives like, for example, UNPRI's Spring Stewardship Initiative and the Nature Action 100's company benchmark, I believe it's called. But we have the explicit aim of providing concrete, practical guidance for the engagement dialogue and actually help you and companies get ready for delivering on the targets that they're setting. And our ambition for Inform is that it might actually help you, asset owners and managers, to unleash your agency, you could say, to improve biodiversity through your investments. And with those words, I'm going to hand over to Emmy and to Hjalmar to guide us through what Inform is and how it can be used.
Thank you, Bea. And so today we are here, as Bea said, to launch Inform, the investor framework for biodiversity risk mitigation. And so what is Inform? Inform is a science-based framework providing guidance for investors on biodiversity risk mitigations and how to engage with companies. It's built around, can you go back one step? It's based around practical engagement questions to help guide investors on which questions to ask, what topics are environmentally material, and what information should you be gathering. And we've also developed two different approaches based on the knowledge of the engagement officer and the maturity of the company, what we call entry-level users and advanced users. So what kind of topics are environmentally material and how should you approach this? Next slide, please. So it's first, we highlight in the Inform material how it's important to understand the chain of reactions or chain of links between what a company does, direct company activities, how that leads to biodiversity impact, but also biodiversity risk. And in the example we see here on the screen, we have drawn up a case example of how this could work, where, for example, a company expands their operations, a natural part of company growth, but that might lead to land use change, for example, deforestation. And if you follow the top line of arrows, we see that this deforestation or land use change could result in the loss of species and ecological functions. That feeds into the global impacts on biodiversity loss and creates ecosystem instability and reduced natural resources at the global scale. And depending on what kind of company this company is, it can either directly affect companies through their operational costs, through loss of natural resources, or through supply chain shortages. Similarly, if we look beyond biodiversity, the second row of arrows highlights that this land use change might also lead to loss of trees and loss of carbon storage, accelerating global warming. Which global warming we've seen very tangibly leads to more intense, more frequent, and changed timing of extreme weather events that disrupts supply chains or operations. And this feeds back into the direct company operations. And so what we want to highlight with Inform is that the information that you need is to understand both biodiversity impact and biodiversity risk is really about understanding company activities and how they impact the local environment. Next slide, please. And so this is also how Inform is unique and a complement to some of the other engagement frameworks out there. We've built up Inform around 5 hierarchical steps that start at the bottom of this pyramid and works their way up, where you start by really looking at what is the root information about the company operations. So understanding the impacts on location, on land use, impacts production and waste, and working your way up towards target setting. And this is both to complement other frameworks out there who start from the top, looking at targets going down, but then also to highlight that in order to know as an investor if the targets set are actionable and environmentally material, you need to have this underlying base information from the lower levels. This is why we set up Inform in this way. Next slide, please. So why should you use Inform? So it's a science-based guidance. The work in Inform is based around peer-reviewed academic research. And so it's science-based guidance with engaging with companies to better understand both the nature-related, climate-related, biodiversity-related impacts and risks. And then tangibly with concrete questions to help identify priorities and opportunities for companies to move from just the ambition and target setting into measuring the correct things and acting on them. And we've also set up Inform to align with other frameworks out there, both reporting standards and global frameworks like the Global Biodiversity Framework. So it's not new information necessarily that's being asked for. It's already information that's being asked by different types of reporting standards and frameworks. Next slide. And I hand over to Hjalmar.
Yes, so I'm going to take you through the actual engagement questions and the actual engagement process with Inform. So all the engagement questions in Inform are organized in 5 levels, as Emmy just mentioned, and these reflect different layers of information, ranging from fundamental operational data, which highlights pressures on nature, to more strategic areas like mitigation strategies and long-term targets. The questions are also grouped into 4 thematic areas, and these are mapping of locations, land use, inputs and outputs, and events and externalities. And these themes are rooted in environmental science and are designed to capture key variables that reveal how a company's operations affect biodiversity and nature. Each engagement question is followed by a short description, either to provide context on its importance or to clarify the kind of response investors should expect. So the questions are also sector agnostic and in that sense applicable to any business or company. That said, we've also created 3 tailored sets of engagement questions for 3 specific sectors. So these are forestry, pulp and paper, mining and metal, and food and beverage retail. So these sets of engagement questions are based on the same questions as the general ones, but removing those deemed irrelevant to the sector and also changing the descriptions to better reflect the unique context of each specific sector. To make Inform useful, regardless of the user's knowledge about biodiversity-related risks, we've also outlined 2 engagement processes, so one for entry-level users and one for more advanced users. And for entry-level users, Inform helps raise awareness around how a business interacts with nature and clarifies what data is needed to establish a baseline. The process begins by addressing all the level 1 questions, focusing on mapping of locations, land use, and input use. And once these foundational areas are understood, Inform can help guide investors in identifying where data collection and mitigation efforts are already in place, where further work is needed. The material also includes multiple practical suggestions that investors can use directly when engaging. On the other hand, advanced users can benefit from exploring the full range of questions in the Inform spreadsheet. By asking a company the questions across all 5 levels, investors can gain deeper insights, identify opportunities for ambitious mitigation efforts, and also evaluate the company's performance across the different thematic areas. In this way, Inform can help investors drive transformation and integration of biodiversity into the business's strategy. The Inform material also provides insights into how advanced users can use the engagement questions for monitoring progress and also to facilitate alignment with reporting standards and sustainability disclosures. And this is a screenshot that gives you just a sense of what the Inform spreadsheet actually looks like. So far to the left, you'll see the 4 thematic areas, or rather just the 3 of them that fit in this screenshot. And each row corresponds to an engagement question, followed by a description and space for answers or notes by the user. And to the far right, there's a column showing each of the questions links to recommendations or data points from the TNFD, GRI, ESRS, and Global Biodiversity Framework. And all questions, except for the very first one, are also categorized into columns based on whether they relate to measurement of impact, mitigation action, or target setting. So if we zoom in, you can see how the questions are structured, with each question having its level indicated in the upper left corner. And for entry-level users, the emphasis is on the foundational levels, as we said earlier, and more advanced users can navigate the full set to gain a comprehensive understanding of a company's nature-related performance and to identify areas of improvement. So if we're to summarize the benefits that come with using Inform, investors can follow an engagement process with structured questions to assess where the impacts are, what's being done, and where action is still needed. The framework therefore guides investors and companies in understanding nature-related impacts and risks and to move from ambition to action. Inform also helps investors engage around nature-related topics with clarity, purpose, and a confidence of being anchored in the latest science by providing concrete questions and suggestions that engagement officers can use when talking to businesses. And then finally, Inform also supports investors who strive to be part of a global shift towards nature-positive business and offers a tool to spur portfolio companies to become more sustainable while aligning with global standards and recommendations. And with that, I give back the word to Emmy.
So the Inform material is all available on the Inform website that you can find in the QR code here. We can also post it in the chat, the link. And on the website, you can read all of the information online, but you can also download the guidance document as a PDF if you prefer. There's also a way to download the Inform spreadsheet if, like Hjalmar showed, you want to use the full set of questions and the space to provide notes and answers potentially. We have videos online that in a brief sort of 3 to 4 minutes explain some of the materials. We have a frequently asked questions page on the website for some of your maybe more frequently asked questions, but we also open up now for a Q&A session where we're happy to try and answer everything that you're wondering about this material. Thank you.
Thank you, Hjalmar. Thank you, Emmy, for that. And that is the cue to the audience to pose questions if you have any. I realize that this is having not engaged with the material beforehand and just hearing this presentation, probably doesn't give you the full understanding. But even so, based on what you've heard now, are there any questions that come to the fore? I'm going to see if I can see people raising their hands here. So please raise your hand. Remember, click on the heart icon at the bottom that says react and then raise your hand. So I'm getting a message here from Natsuko who says if we've tried it with any specific companies, so like an engagement event, and if so, what was learned in that event? Emmy or Hjalmar, would you like to speak to that?
So I can start, and then Hjalmar, you can pitch in. We did it as part of the development of this material. We trialed it with several different investors who either spoke about it in-house, but also some investors actually used it in an engagement talk or an engagement event. And one of the learnings for us from that was really why we developed these different user types, because we realized that it's not only about the previous level of working with these topics of the engagement officer or the investor who's using it, but it's also what types of companies you're engaging with. So if, like the investor in question who was engaging with a sort of solutions company, then they had clearly come much further in their own sustainability work, and so therefore, they could use the full spreadsheet and really fill out and track information across all of these. But then from conversations with other investors who tried it out, this is not always the case, and that's also why we both developed the different user groups, but also developed this hierarchy of questions where we sort of focus on the level ones first and highlight the importance of those, and then build up information. So this is what we got from that. But Hjalmar or Beatrice, you can also.
I can maybe add just something, not directly, but one of the reasons also for, and maybe you guys can give some examples after, but reasons for, providing quite structured question and is that our experience from talking to engagement officers, also, or other people who have been in engagement situations, is that, well, first of all, you don't have a lot of time often, and you need to be very kind of efficient with what you can, to get something out of that time. And the structured question would allow you to sort of at least kind of prioritize what you can get in this particular engagement dialogue and making sure that you get some tangible and actually useful information out of that. But secondly, engagement officers have told us that without having a deep understanding necessarily of biodiversity and nature-related impacts and risks and how those materialize, could, when asking companies what they were doing, could sometimes be given information that might seem relevant or, but actually when looking at it in more detail is certainly biodiversity relevant, but not relevant from a mitigation standpoint of that particular business. As an example, a company says we are doing biodiversity related activities. For example, we're supporting this nature reserve over here, or we are doing beach cleanups, which are not bad in and of themselves, but they are perhaps just detached from the actual operations of that particular business. So they're more compensatory, but sometimes not even compensatory because they may not even be targeting species that are similar or ecosystems that are similar to the ones that are being affected by the business. So Inform is a way to try and get away from that, where in an engagement situation, you are receiving information, but you don't really know what to do with that because and try to help you understand, is this actually relevant information that I am getting? Is this something that will help this company and therefore my portfolio move in the right direction? Or is this something in addition to that?
I can just
Um,
add another thing to that as well, that another interesting thing we learned during piloting is that sometimes it can be difficult for engagement officers to interpret the answers. So something we really tried to do in the revisions after piloting was just to clarify even further the descriptions of each question to really indicate what kind of answer the engagement officer should expect to sort of facilitate that process.
yeah, we're getting some questions now in the chat. So I have one here from Torbjörn, which I'm going to direct translate. Do we believe that the answers to the questions posed by Inform need to come from the companies themselves, or is it likely that some of this information could actually be gotten from other sources, other data sources?
So I can start. I think one of the things that we wanted to highlight with this column that Hjalmar showed with linking to other sort of reporting standards, for example, ESRS, is to highlight where potentially this information could come from company reports. So where you can sort of screen the reports beforehand and get some of the answers to this. With Omnibus, I guess we don't know yet what kind of information will be coming out, but that's the intention behind that. There is, of course, other sort of data sources out there also to maybe get at some of this information. But for example, like linking up to understanding with satellite data, how companies where they're operating and things like that. But we've found from a research perspective that this is actually, it's quite difficult to look at all of these diverse data sets that are out there. And really a lot of the link to company operations will have to come from some kind of company, either report or direct sort of engagement. But the idea behind this column of linking to different frameworks is that if a company reports based on ESRS or TNFD, then you can be able to map which data points answer which questions.
So in a way, you could say that Inform in this initial stage and where we are today in this whole with the investment in the corporate community and researchers, we are in a space where data is lacking on many of these data points. and that's just a fact. So I don't think we expect any engagement officer or asset owner to be able to sit down and get most of this information, perhaps from some European and Northern European countries where a lot of the information is actually being asked to be reported, just not publicly. But I think we can also see it as one piece of the puzzle of trying to shift and push this sort of landscape to and get companies by asking these questions to realize that these are the kinds of information I need to start keeping track of if I'm serious about when I set these biodiversity related targets. So it's equally a sort of like pushing the space for now without perhaps expecting to have full and detailed and accurate information for all the data points, but kind of shifting the mindset as much. I have another question here from George to wondering if you could elaborate on the interoperability or the link of Inform with these other biodiversity investor frameworks like the TNFD. I think you already covered it, but is there anything else that you want to say in terms of how this links to TNFD?
Not related to TNFD. I don't know if Hjalmar, Bia, you want to say something about how it links to the other, like Spring or Nature Action 100. Elaborate on that.
So, George, please, repost or shout out if you feel like you haven't received a good enough answer on how it links to TNFD. But basically, the Inform questions are designed to ask companies for the information that actually overlaps with certain data points of the TNFD and the ESRS. And the material will show you that if I ask the company about this and this and this question, by providing the information, they will actually also become compliant with TNFD number X, ESRS number X, and so on. But get back to us if you don't feel like that was clear. Hjalmar, do you want to say something more concretely and specific on how it would actually, works bottom up, top down, depend like in comparison to Spring and Nature Action 100, which I mentioned at the start?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, when we looked at other frameworks that are out there, we realized that while they fill a very important space, they focus more on the commitments and targets rather than the actual data on input use and land use that we consider to be the pressures that drive biodiversity change. So this is complementary in the sense that it starts from the bottom, in the sense that it focuses on data and data that is representative of pressures on nature and pressures on biodiversity. So we think by using both of these, you could use Inform to sort of get the data and also to cross-check with TNFD and sort of see that you comply with reporting standards. And then frameworks like Nature Action 100 or Spring will help you ensure that you have the right commitments in order to make an ambitious change.
Thanks. Yeah. And I just want to pick up on something that Torbjörn commented here on our response, which is, really we want to make this efficient, and we totally agree. And Torbjörn, you mentioned that perhaps asset owners can join together, and I think that's precisely one of the things that I think we were, perhaps naively hoping, but that we want this space to become more data rich. That's the ambition, I think, because otherwise, without that more granular data on business operations and their locations, we will frankly not be able to say much in terms, at least not credibly, about either the impacts on nature and biodiversity, but also the risks, because the ways to assess impacts and risks, which at the moment would be mostly quite sophisticated models that, but also risk models that, or models to assess the sort of risks from that. They all rely on fairly basic input data that represents sort of environmental pressures or burdens. And these are things like volumes of water used in your operations, amount of land appropriated, and so on and so forth. And that is, if we can get a sort of more a joint ambition from as many investors as possible, pointing in the same direction to sort of these no, I'm not going to say simple. They're not necessarily simple to get, but these 10 to 15 data points, then I think we're going to be in a much more informed space down the line. So having coalitions of asset owners joining together to point to these are the kinds of information points we really want from all our portfolio companies could certainly be, I think, really transformative. I don't know to what degree it's feasible, but I know, of course, that is how the sort of idea and the principle behind how you and PRI work. Anyway, we have other questions. Question here from, sorry, Amanda, saying, wondering if you could elaborate on how the engagement typically would unfold, the engagement process would typically inform. For instance, is the informed spreadsheet intended to be distributed to portfolio companies within a whole portfolio, or have you considered whether the process of both filling the response and assessing them might be time consuming? And are there any strategies to place in place to streamline that? Any thoughts on that?
I can start maybe, and then Yama, you can jump in. I think this is again one of the things that we realized in our piloting phase, that it will really depend on what type of investor you are and what type of companies you have. What we gained from the piloting phase was that if, for example, you are quite a large investee, you own a large share of a company, you maybe have more ability to sort of even send the spreadsheet or some of the questions directly to the companies, have them fill them in beforehand. Whereas for other investors with a smaller share of ownership, then perhaps picking out 2 or 3 questions that you can directly ask in the call is the way the process would work. And this is also why we have these hierarchies of questions to know what you should prioritize based on what information you can already gather. So I foresee that, if you have a company that does report according to some kind of reporting standard, you could first look at what information you can glean from the reports itself, and then see what are the gaps in the lower levels that are not being filled by reporting, and then therefore focus your attention on those, and then tailoring that to the type of engagement that you traditionally have, if it's a short call or if it's a longer dialogue where they can potentially fill out information themselves.
I can just fill in there that when we had this takeaway from piloting, also realized that having the full spreadsheet that you saw earlier during the presentation isn't even fully helpful if you engage with certain companies where they will just get stuck really early on. So in those cases, we think it is more helpful to just look at these basic suggestions and basic tips about how you should start engaging based on these ideas to get biodiversity into the conversation and just start some basic awareness in the organization.
And these are sort of tips or suggestion boxes that Emmy and Hjalmar are referring to, that is actually in the material. They didn't show it here in the slides, but it exists in the material. I see your hand up, Matthias. I'm just going to take one question before that from Alexia, that says the thematic area is land use, but do we see as well that this applies to aquatic area use? And is there a difference of fresh and marine? And she says, in a first look, I would say no, but if so, why? Alexia, please jump in if I'm misrepresenting your question, but just let Emmy and Hjalmar respond. But just to say that we have based this, as we said, on science, and it's in many ways, based on the direct drivers of biodiversity loss as represented by IPBES, which are things like the use of resources, but the use of land and sea area. Also, extraction of and use of resources included in that is, of course, the use of fresh water, for example, and so on and so forth. So the questions in Inform are actually intended to kind of map almost one-to-one onto the direct drivers of IPES in order to provide, as I said earlier, the sort of key building blocks, information data points that we need in order to be able to feed these kinds of data into more sophisticated impact and assessment models and risk assessment models. Most of the models that we have, I would say on the market, but like even in academia, that allow us to do that which can actually provide quite a variety of different sort of biodiversity impact assessments going from population, changes in populations or more wide, like broader things like biodiversity footprints, but also things like INVEST, which tries to understand the changes in actual ecosystem services. All of these models essentially rely on these kinds of information to make them sort of to provide accurate outputs.
And I
Okay.
could maybe pitch in just that I think we use the term land use, that it's to be more generic, that it's habitat use or like area of the world use. So it would also infer sea use or aquatic use. But then what I would say as the caveat is that I think it is slightly more tailored to companies that have at least a semi-fixed area of operations. So certain things that move around a lot and that don't, have a specific area where they're based. I think those are maybe slightly less targeting those, and I think those are more generally the case in marine activities or ocean activities. I guess like fishing is one of those that can move around, but that usually has certain areas. But maybe shipping is another one is more sort of flexible in where it's based. And so I would say that it is slightly more leaning towards companies and operations that have a location where they're based.
Okay, thank you. Matthias, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's super interesting. I had a question about whether you can use the Inform material to assess more indirect effects. So I'm thinking, for instance, about a market effect. So if a company expands its operations, it will use more resources and maybe use more land. So it might look negative in one sense, but it might also be that the products say that this company produces like substitute some other product on the market. So globally, the effect on biodiversity might be positive, even though like the direct effects of the company are negative, or like these, the corresponding like scope 2 and 3 effects are like the energy produced, are those included as well in this? In the Inform material and things like that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. I can maybe jump in straight away because it is something we did think about. It's not hugely elaborated in the material, but there is a section on for especially under the advanced user, like if you have a solutions-oriented company, to highlight this, that yes, potentially then growing and taking up more space and resources can be positive for biodiversity, but therefore we've in this section tailored sort of extra questions that you can then ask about, like for example market share, like is this a product that is replacing something else or replacing activities that are worse, or is it just adding on, like where is this expansion happening? So for example, is it expanding and replacing areas that were previously less positive for nature, or is it expanding and replacing areas that were more positive for nature? So we have a section on that to try and answer some of those questions.
Great,
But maybe
thanks.
I'll follow up
Yeah.
with a question specifically to you two and to myself, but you get to answer. And that is, I think, a question that probably many people are thinking. Is Inform suitable for just primary sector companies? I know you said we have done a specific tailored example for the food retail sector. So how does it deal with scope 3, upstream and downstream? Can you say something about that?
So yeah, again, I can start to blend. I think it's it works. I think it works for companies in other sectors as well. But I think where the focus lies in sort of how to ask the questions differs. So if you, for example, are a primary industry, it's a lot of focus on questions about like land or sea use, and sort of what you're doing at those operational locations. Whereas as you move to other sectors of the economy, then it's more focus on inputs, like what inputs into operations, where are they being sourced from, to understand this sort of, I guess, upstream scope 3. So it's maybe less focus on downstream scope 3, like what's happening to your product then, but really understanding, where are the inputs coming from and what are the effects, both sort of impacts but also dependencies on those inputs.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're engaging with companies that are more in the tertiary sector, although we do not have sector-specific guidance for more than these 3 sectors we mentioned previously, I think it could be helpful to look at the food retail sector-specific guidance, for instance, because there you can find what kind of questions have been excluded because they're not considered fully relevant. And also see how the descriptions are far more catered to reflecting inputs rather than resource extraction. So I think there is some flexibility there in most of the descriptions of the questions.
I will also just add to say that we recognize that, first of all, no sort of tool or process or can ever tick all the boxes, and I think it's the same here. But I think recognizing that you always have to prioritize where you can put your time and effort, particularly asset owners and asset managers. I know Nature Action 100, they went about this by sort of identifying key impactful sectors. I believe there are 8. And I'm not going to reel them off now, but they include like oil and gas and mining and the 3 sectors that we have chosen. And there's a reason for us choosing these 3 specific sectors first that we then pilot tested and did sort of sector specific guidance for, because of course, biodiversity impact can be embedded throughout supply chains and effectively, be relevant to essentially all companies in our economy. But given the data situation at the moment and given the complexity of value chains, if we're going to start somewhere and sort of crawl before we can walk and run, we suggest possibly like this is probably most useful for engagement with those companies in those sort of more high impact sectors. The same ones that have been identified, for example, by Nature Action 100 as sort of 8 big sectors that have a big nature and biodiversity impact. Okay, I have a question here from Vemund that is asking if we plan to engage with data vendors that are offering products on biodiversity so that they can attempt to provide reported or estimated data for the informed questions.
I can start with that one. Currently, we're not really trying to gather in data ourselves or engaging with data vendors to like use Inform as a foundation to gather more data from companies. But these are the data points and indicators that we believe to be really important to understand pressures on nature and impact on biodiversity. So of course it would be great, and it is a potential avenue going forward, but nothing we have planned currently. I'll let the rest of you fill in on that one.
I can maybe only fill in that one of the things that we are, or I say we, but maybe it's me, maybe Beatrice and Hjalmar, you can agree that one of the things we're seeing a little bit is that sort of, especially on products for biodiversity, a lot of the data metrics out there are quite complex and a combination of many different data types. And what we are wanting to highlight with Inform is, like Beatrice said, the sort of pressures of biodiversity, getting at the most granular and data that underpins a lot of the other more complex biodiversity tools and footprints, which we find is a data gap that often you can get some of these more complex metrics, but you lack the underpinning data. And so just wanted to flag that this is also an ambition with Inform, to bring the conversation down to those types of data points.
Yeah, I can just add, and the reason I think also, which those who have listened to me before know that I keep harping on about this, but it's not that I have something inherently against biodiversity footprinting tools, but like Emmy was alluding to, these are actually quite complex metrics that are made up of sort of like combining LCA methodology with linking that to regional sort of input-output tables or environmentally extended input-output table to first estimate pressures. And then you use those pressures again in an LCA method, and you use characterization factors very often from other models. For example, GloBio we see very often used that are not necessarily relevant or appropriate for the particular area where you're trying to estimate impact. And then, but out comes a very generic measure, which is mean species abundance or a potentially disappeared fraction, depending on which specific models or LCAs you're using. And it gives the sense that here's a number. But the thing is, a mean species abundance doesn't really, it's very hard to interpret. It's a very abstract figure. And I would argue that I think most investors or asset owners or asset managers, when they get a figure like that, do you really understand what does that mean, and how can I link it to the pressures that are going on at the particular site of this company? You can't, because of how it's been arrived at. It's very hard to trace transparency. It's therefore very hard to act on. And we wanted Inform to be about data points that are actionable, that you can track over time, and that you can therefore very easily, it's not very complicated. You don't need to understand a biodiversity footprinting tool under the hood, because you can just see, are we using more or less water over the course of the years? Well, perhaps more in total if we are one of these solution companies that are growing, but actually in relation to our output, so like a relative measures, we're actually improving our efficiency. These kinds of more just intuitive and transparent ways of sort of assessing some sort of progress in a direction, rather than tying ourselves to very complicated biodiversity indicators that frankly also are not necessarily going to be the same over time, because these footprinting tools, aspects of them get changed as new models come into place, which means that they're not even comparable over time. So yeah. I have one last question from Natsuko, unless someone has another pressing one, and that is she's picking up on what I said earlier, that nature protection efforts by companies could be things like beach cleanups or protection of an or contribution to a nature reserve or something, that they can compensate, but not mitigate. And she's asking, what did I mean? Did I mean mitigate potential financial risks that the company is facing, or did I mean environmental mitigation? And I've just done a lot of talking. I'm wondering if Emmy or Yalma, if you care to sort of give the example that we actually threw around initially when we were developing the material, and kind of give an explanation for why this came up in the first place.
Yeah, of course. So when we did some piloting, we heard about cases where the engagement officer asked questions about the pressures or the impacts at the locations of the business. And then they heard a lot about other initiatives at other locations. And one of these core ideas of Inform is to get data from the actual operational locations. Because if you're a business that exerts certain pressures on nature that have high impact on local ecosystems, you will have a detrimental impact on that ecosystem. And that is what we want to know with Inform. Having other initiatives elsewhere is, of course, fantastic, but it will not mitigate the actual environmental impact at operational locations. So that's something we really want to emphasize with Inform, that it's about gathering data at the actual operational locations of the businesses that you engage with to sort of really understand what their actual on-site biodiversity impacts are.
Again, to make that data actionable so that because you can look at it and you can say, okay, we are having a high impact in terms of our water use or our land use or something else. And then for that's where we should be prioritizing perhaps our mitigative action and develop strategies around that. If you sponsor or contribute to, turtle conservation in a different country, that is not bad per se, but it's unrelated to the impacts that you are creating, and therefore, it sort of should be treated as a separate thing. So that's what Inform is designed to try and help you as an investor not get waylaid by those kinds of initiatives if they're brought up in an engagement situation. They're good, sure, but bring it back to what the focus is, which is trying to understand the business operation, its impact, and therefore, when we know the impacts, we can also assess what risks may come from that.
Yeah, and just on this, like if it's environmental mitigation or mitigation of financial risks, Inform is really about like gathering the information that can make you aware of which one of those it is. So understanding a company's both impacts and how, but also sort of dependencies, what they are dependent on from nature, so that you can also say like, is there a direct financial risk linked to this impact, or is there potentially a transition risk linked to regulation or policy around environmental impact? So
I see no more questions.
I think
And oh,
just see if there was a question. I don't know if we caught it from Anna about how this framework operates across diverse sectors, countries,
yes, you're
considering
right.
the varying natural environmental values and context, and how to adapt questions or approaches accordingly.
Thank you.
I think we touched a little bit on this, and I think one of the things that we've tried with the general questions is for them like to use in the description column, really highlight like why are we asking this question, so that if you have them varying contexts or sectors, that can help you as an investor also then maybe tailor the question. If you find that the generic one that we've stated doesn't fit the specific context, to really sort of provide information on why we are asking or why we suggest that this question should be asked. And then I think we also touched a bit upon it earlier, the different entry points depending on, I guess, the environmental values where the company is operating. I think in certain areas, like Beatrice was mentioning, where environmental regulation is stronger, I think companies have had to think more about this and are maybe have an easier time filling in or answering these questions, rather in places where environmental regulation or values is lower.
Yeah, so I think we can say the entry-level user versus the advanced user doesn't have to reflect your level as an engagement officer, as an asset owner. It may reflect the maturity around these topics of the markets where these companies are operating. So for example, even though you may have quite a lot of understanding of this, you can still think about like your portfolio spanning these different regions. So if you have assets or holdings in emerging markets, and you know that here these questions are not very mature, they don't have much regulation around this, and therefore I really need to be thinking about this from an entry level user kind of perspective, starting only with very simple questions, level 1 questions here, to just try to get these companies on board and begin the journey, so sort of in maturation around these issues of those companies. Whereas, holdings in your portfolios from a different region might, as Emmy said, be sort of already there, and you can apply other questions that are, pertain to level 2 or 3, because maybe they have already mapped their sites, or they already have that, at least, that understanding, because they've had to report on it, for example, under the jurisdictions that they are operating. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. And with that, I think we are coming to the end of the hour, and I'd like to thank our presenters. Thank you, Emmy and Hjalmar. And I would also like to, thank Sustainable Finance Labs, Svesis, everyone else who contributed to spreading the word about this, about the webinar, but also to everyone who took the time to show up. And I can't remember if you said this, Emmy, but you can find all the material. You see it on the slide, but also this is, I would say, work under slow progress now. We are launching this now out into the public domain, hoping that investors of different kinds can start using it and trying it out. We recognize that something like this, probably there's no one size fits all. But we're putting there out there for you to use and react to, and we are more than welcome, more than welcome. We more than welcome feedback from you on this. We can't guarantee that we will be able to tweak things, or I can say we won't be able to tweak things on a sort of weekly, monthly basis. But our ambition is to now collect feedback, and then say within about 10 to 12 months, do a revision and see what can be improved and so on. So see it as a work in progress, and see it as you have a chance here to really help us improve this and make it something that can be used more at scale, if you think this is useful. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, that ends our webinar.